Okay, the first thing that we want to do when we start to render or even draw our car is to worry about the construction. Previously, in some of the YouTube videos, you've seen that I do a lot of these parallel view. And the first thing that I do when I go with these parallel perspective views is to start off with the wheelbase and just to ensure that I've got the right layout. For this particular demo, we're going to use just a hammer mill 11 by 17 paper with a chart pack marker, which is dark olive. When you start to establish the wheelbase, this particular drawing is going to start with around 2.5 wheel spaces. That's the typical needed for a sports car sedan when you look at proportion. I've got about a 40-degree ellipse, and there's typically a 10-degree difference between the front and the rear wheel. So that's how we want to set up the drawing when we start off, is to ensure that we've got wheel space spacing that's giving us the proportions of a sports car. We're getting started now, and I've got a chart pack P24. It's a dark olive marker. And the first thing that I've established is to establish the angle. So one of the things that I do when I start off drawing is to not always draw my cars horizontally, but if you notice that if you start to tilt the angle, that it adds a little bit more drama to your drawing. So that's kind of nice. I mean, to add that angle, and you notice that in a lot of comic books and a lot of other artists. And when you rotate that page, it brings that extra amount of movement and dynamism to your sketch. So that's what we're going to be doing here. So carefully kind of plot that out. You don't have to do that in this particular exercise. It's just because that's how I'm doing it here, and that's just the reasoning behind it. I've quickly, within just a matter of a couple minutes here, I'm just outlining the car. And what I've done is I've added my ellipses, and I've added my general shape of the vehicle. And this is going to be a two-door sports car, obviously. It's just the one door you see on that one side. And what I'm doing is that as I start to draw, one of the important things is it's really important to look at photo reference before you start drawing your concept vehicles, because just to understand forms and how they work is pretty important. And just blocking in shapes, it's really hard at the beginning to understand all those things without at least copying or looking at some sort of photo reference at the beginning. And that's really going to be important to give that sense of realism to some of your work, because you have to understand your proportions, you have to understand placement of headlamps, something that is plausible. And what I'm drawing here is something that is plausible in the fact that you see these kind of cars out there today. It's nothing very crazy. The shape is not so out of the ordinary that it's doesn't look like you can manufacture it. It's something that is pretty common. So what I've done here is, you can see I've identified sections too. I want to show you where these lines or the shape of the hood is going to be, and how I just describe that form. You'll see how all this sort of goes when we get into the rendering part. We'll kind of hide all these things. I got my ground plane, and I've lightly gone over the tire, and I'm gonna leave the rear tire. In fact, I'm not going to detail this one out. So we're just going to focus on probably 3/4 of the car and then leave the rest of it alone. I'm going to go back and start to indicate the headlamps here. Just put some details and just sort of indicate where the lights are, and just sketch around it. Now we've got looking at some more definition here at the front portion of the vehicle, and then also placement of your fog lamps. Again, all you have to do is you want to look at some of the other vehicles out there. Now, I look at everything. I may look at a Ford. I may look at Chrysler, some of the supercars. I might look at luxury vehicles, BMWs, Ferraris, whatever I can to sort of kit bash. It's pretty popular when you look and when you read some magazines that talk about people who do create models, Star Wars models. What they essentially do is just take bits and pieces from each model and then they construct something new. And that's what I'm doing here, is that I'm looking at ideas and I'm looking at other kinds of photo references, and I essentially build a mental or visual vocabulary in my head after I've drawn them so many times. And then I start to replicate that and say, hey, this would be kind of cool here. But I'm also mindful that when you're doing it, you have to have some sort of aesthetic unity. That means you can't just draw the stuff. You have to maybe manipulate that shape a little bit and say, hey, we want some continuity in the design so that everything kind of works in harmony. Okay, so the other thing that you're noticing, I want you to look at how I'm applying this marker and using that chisel point. That chisel point, it's really important to visualize and get a hang of how to handle the marker. It's very easy to be very heavy-handed, and if you go heavy-handed, then you end up getting blotches of ink. You have to move pretty fast. I'm just going to start to draw the spokes, the wheels. It's going to be a 5-spoker. And then I'll end up creating the shadows and then start to darken the inner part of the wheel. And that'll allow the spokes to sort of pop out. Be mindful, we're just doing this straight with a marker. I always freak out too. I'm just like all of you. Sometimes I hate just starting with a marker, because if I mess up, I'm done. But at the same time, you do it enough, then you don't care. And that's what you want to get to that point. Ever so light of a touch, just lightly touch, and then go back, reinforce. I made a little mistake there, and I'm just going to turn that into a reflection. The little tricks that if you mess something up, it's okay. You go in and see, okay, what can I turn this into, as I swipe that marker through, not paying attention. So I'm just going to turn that into a reflection, which is fine. Okay, so this is fleshing out pretty good. I don't know what it looks like. It's kind of like a cross between a Mazda. Looks like a Mazda and a little bit of a, I won't say BMW. I guess BMW from the that surface on the side facing. BMW has some great angles on them. I love them. One of my favorites. All subjective, of course. I'm going to draw that rear wheel on the other side. I think this is just about it. As you can see, this is really a simplified version. I just want you guys to understand that we can do many different things with reflections. We can make it a lot more realistic. We don't have to block them out. But if you are just starting out, I don't think it's hard to really understand all that level of detail. So that's not what we're going to do in this example. Our main thing is just to indicate the form. We don't have to get into a lot of gradations. But what I do want to show is that even without all that, it's going to be a very effective drawing. Without putting all that detail and trying to get it extremely photorealistic, you can still create a very effective illustration as it is. And be mindful. Remember what we're doing here. We're still only working off of one marker. One marker color, that's it. I mean, later on when we get to the rendering portion, we'll change some things up. We'll end up using some white pencils and gouache, all this other stuff will start to come into play with it. But when we get into the chalk and the pastels, that's where we're going to add a little bit more color. But this is just about done as far as additional work. I'm just going over the drawing, just seeing what else I need to add here, and I think this is fine. You don't want to overwork it, which I have a tendency to do sometimes. It's just to keep going. like I'm doing here. I think I can leave that tire alone, but yeah, I keep going over it. Mind you, again, this is not marker paper. It is a treated paper, laser paper, hammer mill, which does a pretty good job, but it does bleed. That's why I have a sheet in the back of it. So, all right, I think we're set and we're ready for the next stage. I'll just sign it here, and we'll see you here in the next phase of the drawing.